All right, starting over. Yes, we are starting over. And hopefully, I will not step into the camera cable again. That's what I seem to have done, and therefore messed up the on time broadcast. But I kind of intentionally did not announce this podcast in advance because I couldn't make up my mind what I wanted to talk about. And I last minute decided to talk about the phenomenon of the 100th monkey effect and genetic resonance and zeitgeist, these phenomena that are easily observable, however, are not the real science, or we're switching into this quantum field of science only very, very slowly, and our textbooks definitely are 50 years behind in so many ways. And some of it may be intentional, some of it may not be intentional because people really can't get their minds to get into this new way of thinking or paradigm of thinking that we're actually already living in, but are not quite aware of. So, welcome to Real Humans, Great Souls. And the last week I talked about Cat Williams and integrity and this whole awakening that's taking place in the direction of awareness of where we compromise ourselves and where we have come into this culture of compromising, and of course the culture of not wanting to know what else is going on in the vibes of the world and between humans. So maybe this is a good continuance of exploring that. What is that? What is the 100th monkey effect? Which I think is also happening because of Cat Williams' interview on the show Shay Shay, or the Shay Shay show, which way around is it? That has demonstrated this incredible ripple effect, as though everybody wants to come forth and say, I too was already thinking in that direction. I too have noticed. I too was wanting to express myself and maybe have expressed myself. So again, one thing triggers and everybody comes to that same utterance or something similar that they've discovered in themselves. And, some will say, oh, that's just imitation. They just also want to be in the limelight. And of course, you could say that about me too. I just also wanted to talk about this phenomenon of Cat Williams talking with such honesty. I mean, for me, of course, a couple of exaggerations that went into his comedic performances of, using exaggeration to illustrate the point and to trigger a hilarious image in the listener's mind. So today it's all about, let me rearrange myself here. It's all about the 100th monkey effect first. And what is that? And of course, the many attempts of debunking that whole idea. And I then want to lead it back or lead it forward or lead it, I love connecting the dots and explore the greater connectivity of the phenomena observed. So the 100th monkey effect is an observation that scientists made on a Japanese island when at the end of the Second World War, a food was introduced on that island that previously was not that prevalent, and that is feeding sweet potatoes or storing a lot of sweet potatoes for the soldiers, I guess, housed on the island. Not quite sure the greater circumstances on that island. And it was observed that monkeys imitated humans washing the sweet potatoes in river water or in ocean water, and supposedly imitated that behavior and started eating these or stealing these sweet potatoes and also washing them. And that was not a behavior that was previously observed, even when there were sweet potatoes available for monkeys. And when enough monkeys imitated this behavior or learned this behavior, if you will, suddenly the entire species on other islands as well performed the same behavior that it previously had not done. Now, to my knowledge, that is just one example. I have not found, somebody has accumulated lists of similar examples. I have not found it. I tried to Google it, but I did not find it. But it's not really the point that there are lots of different examples. The point is that I'm going to give you just 3 examples of different such events, and then what we want to discuss is really what is that phenomenon, not really is this real or is this exaggerated or is this does this have another explanation. The next example that I came across when I was very young is that even before I came across the 100th monkey definition and that example of the Japanese islands and the monkeys there, was that I was told that in England, in fact, when I was in Scotland in 1971, 72, the phenomenon was that some seagulls in the south of England had discovered that milk bottles, and that was the time in which milk was delivered fresh every morning, in glass bottles with a little aluminum top over it, but it was a thin aluminum, like a thin aluminum skin pressed onto the top to avoid stuff falling into the bottles. And these bottles would sit outside the doors of people on the stoop, on the steps. And seagulls had discovered that you could pick through the aluminum foil over the top of these bottles and get to the cream, which at the time milk was not homogenized. So the cream of the milk would rise to the top, and there was this thick layer of cream at the top of each bottle. And the seagulls in the south had begun to get to these bottles before humans could take them inside and pick through the aluminum foil and get to the cream. And that took place for a little while in the South, and somebody noticed this new phenomenon that their milk was no longer safe on the porch or on the steps. And it was only happening in the South, but a few days, weeks, I did not learn the exact time limit, but in a relatively short period of time, suddenly all seagulls along the entire coast up to Scotland and everywhere were doing the same thing, and milk could no longer be left on the steps or stoops of houses, because the seagulls, if you were relatively close to the ocean, seagulls would come and get to your cream. So that was the very first example that I heard. And that was explained at the time with, there is such a thing as a species-wide awareness, consciousness, a species-wide soul, or whatever you want to call that, that when enough animals have adapted to a behavior, and of course the behavior is, if you will, caused by bottles with an aluminum top sitting outside of doors, right? 300 years ago, they didn't have that, at least not in this format. They probably had cork tops, or I don't know what they had, but they did not have these thin aluminum foils that you could peck through. So animals adapt to what they can do with the technology that changes, or the human environment that changes, right? So, however, when one part of the species had learned this behavior, suddenly the entire species was performing the same thing without having contact with each other. Not that, okay, now this village and one bird flew over to that village, like the messenger carries it forward, but boom, all at the same time. The third example, I was told by my dentist, inventor, holistic researcher in Germany, who came across this experiment. He was also an inventor and was very, very curious about this phenomenon. And this is what he told me. The Morse code, of course, has been invented in the 1800s. In fact, we can look it up quickly. When was the Morse code invented? Where's my mouse here? And people learned it everywhere in the world, right, where they started messaging each other via Morse code. Okay, when was Morse code invented? In the 1830s. So it is quite old. And it used electricity to telegraph these sound codes or vibration codes, right? Because of course sound operates in a wavelength. It's a wavelength, and in the case of Morse code, it's just longer and shorter sounds that travel without wires and can be perceived at the other end and written down and deciphered like a language. There's some beautiful, unfortunately, I can't share screen like I could in a Zoom recording, right, with you here. But there are these beautiful examples of what that looks like, the patterns of the Morse code and which is which letter, right? So the Morse code was invented and telegraphically transmitted. And of course, the inventor being Samuel Morse. And the Morse code became a human-wide accepted form of communication without variations, really. Of course, every language had to adapt it to their letter system or character system, whichever they used, but the codes of longer and shorter beeps, if you will, sound waves, that would create the message in the European languages using letters, right? There's a certain code for letters, and some short words have just one code, so that you could transmit mostly short messages, because it takes a long time to put words together in Morse code. But this was a language that was accepted worldwide. And that means species-wide, this Morse code was already in the memory, even though most of us never learned the Morse code, right? Most of us did not. We just have heard or seen it in movies like I have no idea what I just Morse coded here, but you get the gist. So this system was in place. Now in the 1990s, a group of European scientists had decided they were going to invent better Morse codes. And mouse, okay. Techno ignoramus that I am. So yeah, so there was a new Morse code, or several new Morse codes. Several scientists developed different Morse codes, and they wanted to find a better Morse code that they were going to teach the world that was going to be easier. And they started teaching groups of people these Morse codes, trying to figure out that they had exactly the same level of education and intelligence, etc., in this group and that group and the other group, and gave these groups respectively the different Morse codes and also the old Morse code. And in spite of the fact that they were so sure that their Morse codes were, or their codes, of course, they would not then be Morse codes, but their codes would then be easier to learn and better, in every test that they did, the people, without knowing which Morse code they were learning, the people being given the old Morse code always learned it fastest and memorized it better. And they could not figure out why that would be the case when they were convinced that their Morse codes were easier and better, faster, simpler. And eventually came to the interpretation, if you will, that this phenomenon occurred because the old Morse code was already in the human psyche, even though the people learning the codes had no idea which code they were learning. Because, I mean, if you gave me 5 different types of codes, I wouldn't know which one is the original one, right? But of course, these were just subjects in studies who were given a code to learn, right? This one, this one, this one, this one. The groups they tried to get the groups to be exactly the same kind of backgrounds and persons and mix of people, women and men and so forth, younger and older. And even the younger ones would learn the old Morse code fastest. So that was the solution they found for this otherwise unexplainable phenomenon, that the old Morse code was learned better, faster, because it was already in the human experience as a species, if you will, maybe in the genetic code somewhere, because it's already in the field. I'm sure that is true for all kinds of other electronic and electric information as well, and wavelengths that we are now all exposed to. We can't just wipe them out of the next generations because we pass them on. So, yeah. Think about these 3 examples. The monkeys who learned to wash their sweet potatoes, which is kind of seems actually the weakest of the examples. The seagulls that discover that they can pick through the aluminum cover of milk bottles and get to the cream. They're not really interested in the milk, they're just interested in the cream. And the Morse code that is learned easiest when it is the old one. And understanding or getting sort of a little bit of a sense of what is this species-wide thing that exists, whether we like to acknowledge it in science or not, it is real because there's so many examples of where that happens, can lead us to other biological phenomena such as genetic resonance or menstrual synchrony or the seeking of similarity in organ transplants between the donor and the recipient, not just by blood type, but also by such things as will to live, not depressed. Interestingly, I years ago came across a book. I did not get the book. I just read some of it online. That the recipient of an organ, it could be a kidney or a liver or a heart, of course, being the most impactful one, but also these other organs that are often transplanted now would receive some of the personality or some of the habits that the donor organ would bring into the genetic code of the recipient. So that it was very important that both had the will to live as sort of the basis, right? That's why often motor bicycle fatal accidents, young people were the best organ donors. And I mean, it sounds really, really callous, I guess. I would tell my kids, because I did not want them to get fascinated by motorbikes and riding motorbikes, because I'd seen the statistics of how incredibly dangerous that is. So when we were driving a lot across the American countrysides, we would call motorbikes when they drove by on highways, we would call them organ donors. Watch out for the organ donors. And yeah, it sounds really not very nice, right? Because here are people who are enjoying the wind in their hair or on their motorbikes. It's a whole thing. And we're calling them that because it is so dangerous. In any case, so back to why young people full of life and the will to live, not suicidal, not depressed, not obese, not full of anxiety, anger, and those kind of things, but you wanted to have the organs from people who did not die voluntarily, certainly, to transplant those organs into a person who also had the will to live, was not depressed or giving up. And this is documented in the transplant histories. And I just came across it again that that it was actually that doctors would actually make a point of making sure to pick the recipients of organs by that quality, that they really, really had a will to live and goals and a sense of purpose, etc., because that would provide the best survival chance. Now, you could say they were going to do the right thing once they got that got that new organ, they wouldn't be fooling around. Yeah, but even if everybody does physically the right thing, eats the right things, breathes, exercises, blah, 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 there is still that mental, emotional component necessary to bring your body to accept that organ, to work with that thing that your immune system actually wants to discard as something foreign, right? This is not mine, get rid of it. And it's an interesting realization that shows us how connected the biology is to our mental state and also to the greater vibe in our own environment and in the species. So I thought from there I'll get even crazier. And talk about a few observations that have been made keeping genetic material and splitting it in two glass containers, the same genetic material, and putting them on opposite sides of the room, adding something to one that was maybe hurtful or altering that genetic material, and the other half across the room reacts, even though the same thing is not done to that material. So those experiments have also shown an interesting phenomenon that is then called genetic resonance. So the same genetic sequence in us resonates in another human being because, of course, we all have lots of genetic components in common. And we can, we can climb into all kinds of hoops if we go further into this phenomenon and say, if we all, and of course we've had these experiments, right? If we all think positive thoughts, something happens beyond our own immediate sphere or environment. Of course, there have been prayer circles or meditation circles. And there was one in New York where the day that they all came together and did their meditation for peace and love, and that day and the next day there was a reduction of a very measurable 25% reduction in crime throughout the city. So these are real things, and I don't know whether one could keep it up, but it shows us so much more about our effect, the effect of our thoughts and our being and our intentions into the world. So that then leads us to maybe also thinking about telepathy, distance healing. But let's first talk about telepathy. I became familiar with telepathy when I lived in Norway. I was 14 years old, and I lived with my godmother and her husband, who was a priest. And however, they were also interested in the old traditional indigenous peoples in the northern parts of Norway called Lapland. And I don't know what the correct name is of the Lapland people. They used, I was told, and again, this is just transmission from those times in those cultures, they used telepathy to communicate with each other, to call upon each other when they needed something or were traveling toward each other and wanted a meal, so to speak, upon arrival to be given to them. And again, I, at the time, remember very clearly that it made total sense to me that in a harsh landscape of snow and ice, and I was in Norway in the winter time, so 3-4 feet of snow all the time was normal. There was only one city I traveled to where the Gulf Stream touches, that's in Bergen, and it was late in my stay, so it was in the spring, where there was actually no snow and kind of a relatively mild climate. But yeah, I learned about Lapland and the old indigenous cultures communicating using telepathy. Made sense to me, even though I've probably tried it many times, but was not necessarily successful. Now, when we have close loved ones, and certainly also when we have children, we think we have that connection. And often we hear and talk about how we had a feeling about somebody, something, somewhere. But because we are so evidence drenched, not drenched, no, what's the right word? We're so convinced that everything must have evidence before we can even talk about it or discuss it or trust that there is some truth to it. Because there's so little hard evidence, and we like to be hardwired into needing that hard evidence, we tend to not allow ourselves to explore these phenomena. I'm going to have some of my smoothie so that I can be functioning better in my telepathy here. All right, cheers. It looks very dark, kind of, because it's got both dark kale and red cabbage in it, and otherwise lots of beautiful fruit, and it's sweet and delicious. Back to telepathy. There is, of course, also distance healing. And while I had heard about its existence, the first person I knew close up and personal, my godfather, told me about how he was healed from a severe, I can't remember, I think it was also a heart problem, heart issue, toward the end of the Second World War, by a woman who distanced healed him. And of course, many people have stories. I myself was working with a Russian distance healer when my kids were in middle school, that age. So it must have been in the early 2000s. Yeah. And of course, there are also our good old psychics, right? And all these people who step into acknowledging that there is such a thing as perception and exchange beyond the physically visible. There's, of course, also now all the electromagnetic and micro electronics and sound waves, etc., that science and warfare, unfortunately, has been exploring. And just today, I came across a interview from 2012 where a scientist or two scientists explore the 9/11 phenomena of dustifying, turning into dust, solid matter, by way of, we don't really know what means, similar to implosion materials, or what's the word? Electromagnetic weapons using microwaves or mixtures. I am not that familiar, but I know from having interviewed a gentleman who had been selling, and I should really interview him for the podcast again, who had been selling as a defense contractor, selling such weapons to other countries around the world 30, 40 years ago, 20, 30, 40 years ago, and then stopped and had this awakening for himself as to what he was doing to humanity and what these actual forces that lie in magnetic, electronic, microwave, sound wave fields that are invisible, what the power is that can be used for good or destruction. Bad, it sounds too simplistic. For construction or destruction, let's put it that way. So obviously there are things that we cannot see, but that are very real. Magnetism is one of those elements. It's not an element in the physical way, but a phenomenon, if you will, that we cannot see, but that is an incredibly strong power, right? That I always use the element of, or the phenomenon of, putting two negative ends of magnets together and feeling that incredibly impenetrable field between these two, even though there's nothing you can see. Sound waves have long, of course, been explored as elevating the spirit, harmonizing with the human body. The human body actually has built into it the harmonics of the scale that we find everywhere in the world, and the harmonies, na ni na ni na na na, right? These are sound waves that double and treble and harmonize or collide and disharmonize, and or are so powerful because they resonate with certain elements in our physiology, in our biology, that we can be impacted or even destroyed by them. All right, but enough now about the biology and the 100th monkey effect, and not affect, effect, the 100th monkey effect and genetic resonance, and getting to the last word on the title, Zeitgeist. I love connecting the dots, right? I love connecting what leads to what, and why this is logical, that if you have X, you will have Y, you will have Z, because that fits the same system. If you have competition, you have war, you have this, you have that, you have scales, you have measuring elements, you have derogatory behaviors, and you have elitist behaviors. You have all these follow from the simple concept of competition, of empirical structures, of hierarchical structures, which again are all based in this one thing: competition. I need to be better than others, right? I need to have more, etc. So I like making these large scale analyses, because then we can understand why this stuff is happening in the world on all levels, from the war in the Middle East to pedophilia and child rape and exploitation and all of those things, because they all follow the same system. So the zeitgeist of, I've talked about patriarchy, I've talked about obedience, I've talked about this whole thing of oppression and victimhood and competition, the scale of things that was the zeitgeist of the last 6,000-7,000 years. And something is happening, even though not all humans partook in that system. Most cultures around the globe did. And for some reason, and of course, the era people who observe the planets and the movements and who have understanding of these rhythms on the planet, right? And everything lives in rhythms and in cycles. But the cycles don't repeat exactly. They always repeat slightly differently, or maybe they evolve a little, and maybe they devolve and change into a different kind of cycle. I am not a Darwinist. And of course, I'm not a creationist either. But I love observing these large eras of humanity. And we're only beginning to understand that there were other big eras before this patriarchal era. Humans have not always been, I've said that so many times, in a patriarchal setup. That is a construct of the era. And now you could say, yeah, humans created that, and therefore it must be in the human spirit. But why is it then that this human spirit is changing and we no longer willingly submit? We know, I mean, unfortunately, we get duped back into it, right? Again and again and again with different means, because of course, all kinds of, there can be physical violence, there can be oppression by physical violence, there can be exploitation by blackmail. See Whitney Webb's book, Nation Under Blackmail. But that's not a new, all of these are not new phenomena. They are all phenomena that come with the patriarchal hierarchical era. And for some reason, we don't quite want that anymore. We women don't want that anymore. We want to give children human rights and not see them as property of the father anymore. We want to see equality, even though we don't have it at all in the world. We have great inequality, but we have the concepts of equality now. And that is, to me, a new phenomenon that shows us that there is indeed a new era emerging. And we have the phenomena of seeing through some of the hierarchical schemes. And while the lure of belonging to the rich and famous and the makers of the ones on top of the system, on top of the pyramid, right up there, right? While the lure of maybe becoming one of the super rich is there, more and more of us don't want that, don't need that anymore. So that's another phenomenon of zeitgeist, that we're coming out of an era, moving into the next era. Now, what happens in these transitions, and maybe all along, is that steps in the direction of the new era get co-opted by the old paradigm, get perverted and used to hold on to the old system. Take what happened in the 1970s and the peace and love and make love movement, the hippie movement, and the true search for that openness, that not seeing another human being as a possession, but as a partner with whom to exchange a loving experience, was co-opted into the free sex for all, kind of, in the Western world at least, commercialization of that phenomenon and that desire. So you have a movement that wants to go into the next era, co-opted into serving the perpetuation of the old, the possessiveness, the ownership of human bodies, especially women and children. So that's old. That's the old paradigm. And therefore, all this stuff about pedophilia, etc., is not new. It's the old taking new forms, and we're now seeing it. And we're now openly saying it's wrong. 500 years ago, nobody would have said it's wrong. It's just what is, right? Because the boss owns everybody. The king owns everybody, can do what the king wants. Father knows best, etc. I've talked about all of that so many times. So there's, in addition to the 100th monkey effect, there's an era effect where all of humanity in all the different places in the world wants to transition into a more equitable social order. And you see that in the communist movements, yes, again, they get distorted. Yes, again, they get dictatorial, because humans are not mature enough, ready to actually be co-responsible for the whole thing to work, which is what you would need. A real cohesive social fabric made out of different people with equal rights, but different qualities and different contributions to the community, expects a new level of maturity that most do not have yet. And I may sound condescending here, but it is. And all of us who are promoting, know from our promoting this new being, know from our own experience, from our own imprints, from our own deep, cultured and taught and indoctrinated behaviors and feelings, even, that it's very deep to come out of this property thinking into a true human being thinking. Back to the 100th monkey effect, and the thought among many of my colleagues and myself that if only we can spread enough of that feeling of living free of fear, living free of anxiety, turning fear and anxiety into awareness and into understanding, so that more people can get into the being rather than the owning modality of existence. There will be this 100th monkey effect that an entire group of people, an entire humanity switches into a new level of consciousness. It's not going to happen like this. It happens over decades, maybe even hundreds of years. But it has begun. And my time is up. And it's always just perfect. I've just gone through what I wanted to talk about. It's pretty cool. So, yeah, just to wrap it up, join those groups that stand in their beauty, stand in their truth, stand in their authenticity of individuals being capable of loving and peaceful resolution and understanding each other, even understanding the gruesomeness, because only if we understand where all of that is coming from, and if we do not react, but allow them to look into the mirror. And yes, the mirror can be large demonstrations. The mirror can be large petitions, etc. All of those are, to me, more mirror, show you the mirror actions than beating back with the same kind of gun. So, stand in your maturity. Get rid of fear. It is of the old era, and it empowers those you allow to infuse you with fear, and it disempowers you. That's it for the Zeitgeist part, for the 100th monkey part, and let's create all that genetic resonance around the globe. Look at all the Dr. David Martin discussions. Look at, so in Europe, I just heard a fantastic talk between Daniele Ganser, a Swiss gentleman, and Dre Hammer, a peace movement leader. Let me just look it up, because I need to leave you with this. My sister sent it to me. Eugene Draveman, but in English it would be Drew a man. Draveman, peace promoter. Of course, both authors and highly respected for their analysis of the status quo and promoting what could be done if we arrived at that maturity of the new zeitgeist. Mwah! Let's do it. Create the 100th monkey effect, everybody. Ciao.